Hello and welcome to the DRPT Fleet tool. In this video, we will be reviewing how to use this Excel file to produce cost and emission estimates for your transition to low and zero emission vehicles. These calculations will be based on your current and anticipated fleet inventory and available infrastructure, so they do rely on your input. So before we get started, we're going to go ahead and just review the different tabs that are available here and make sure that we have an understanding of what to expect in each tab. So in the instructions tab, as a general overview of the different data points that are collected in this tool and how to input different information into the field that you'll find in the relevant tabs. You can always reference this video as well, but the instructions tab found here, as well as the user guide found on the DRPT website, are both useful tools as well. In addition to the instructions tab, we have two blue tabs to the right of that, fleet input and infrastructure input. The blue tabs are for inputting data from the agency as much as possible. So you'll see in the fleet input tab, which we'll go over, and in the infrastructure input tab, opportunities to provide information about your service and about your capital that you have to impact the output of the model. In the moves output tool, this is this kind of beige, brownish tab in the middle here. This is an optional input tab where you can do a run in moves, which is a separate model, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. But you can provide additional data here to help tailor the emissions analysis to your fleet. If you do not choose to provide additional data for this, it'll use default data that we have inserted into this tab. And then on the right, there's three green tabs for outputs. The green tabs do not require you to put in information at all. Most of the information that you're going to be entering as you use the tool are in the fleet and infrastructure inputs tab, and then the moves tab if you choose to. On the green tabs, you're mostly collecting information via graphs and tables that the model is outputting that you can then use in reports or presentation materials or just for your internal reference. Now, as we go through the tool, specific cells are also color-coded to help provide clarity for what can and can't be edited. So green cells like this can be edited. And even if the field is in green but includes some kind of data here in italics already, it can be overwritten. Italics data just implies data that's been provided based on our research or experience, but it's not necessarily tailored to a specific agency. So if you have different information, you can always put in your own information there. If a cell is not marked in green, so for example, if you scroll down to the fuel types table, you do not need to worry about entering any information here for that. Any cells that are in white or in gray might contain formulas or other information, so they shouldn't be tampered with as it may result in errors or miscalculations. So no need to worry about anything not in green for the purposes of this tool. So we're going to start and we're just going to go through the fleet input tab first and make sure that we understand kind of how to use the different tables in this tab. The first table we're looking at is the vehicle procurement cost table. And so here we have information on the base cost for different vehicles based on vehicle length and vehicle fuel source. Now, these are already populated based on available data from DRPT and the fleet-wide Trans Am data source and other research. But if you know that you're providing or buying a specific type of vehicle that costs more or less than what's reflected here, you can feel free to change this at any time to be more accurate with what values that you're seeing. So if you have a specific battery electric bus that's being procured within the next year and you've got a quote for it, go ahead and feel free to update that number to reflect what you're seeing and what you've been quoted. Now, again, this is base cost only. If we scroll back up to the About the Agency table here, what you'll see is an opportunity to provide additional costs for options for your buses or provide more specificity on a tax rate if you're getting taxed at a certain percentage, or if the tax rate changes and there's a new one that needs to be applied, you can always enter that in here. Scrolling down, below these two tables on the left of this tab is the BEB specifications table. So this is battery electric buses. What you're going to see here are three different columns for BEB efficiency, capacity, and BEB capacity source. So if you are going to be buying battery electric buses in the future, your cost per vehicle are going to be impacted by the range of your vehicles and the battery capacity. So go ahead and enter those values here if you're going to be making those purchases and you do know them. That way you can always reference this later if those changes. And as a note, you'll see little comments throughout the document and throughout the tool. These are just to remind you, again, as another way of referencing what definitions are in case you don't want to flip back to the instructions tab or you can't remember what we mean by battery efficiency or capacity and things like that. You'll see these notes in here to help guide you and provide some information on what that might look like. As we scroll over now to the right, and then back to the top, what you'll see is the current bus fleet data table. Now, this is one of the most critical tables for producing an accurate analysis for cost estimates and for emission estimates. The model needs to know what you have in your fleet right now that you're looking to transition and the mileage for those vehicles that you're typically encountering on a year-to-year basis. So entering in all that information for each of these columns as accurately as possible is really important. You'll see here is the first column is just for depot. That's for reference. Bus length, you'll select from a drop-down here. For bus series or bus ID, again, this is just for reference. It won't be used in a formula. For fuel type, this is another important one. So we need to know the specific fuel type for the vehicles that you have. What you'll see for the first service year and expected last service year, you'll want to input that information based on when your vehicles went into service and when their expected last year of service is. For fixed route vehicles, we typically use 12 years. And for cutaways, we typically use 7 years. So you'll see those reflected in this example here. And then the quantity of each vehicle is really important as well. So you don't necessarily have to, if you have 6 Ford Transits, for example, that are all the same make and model and fuel type, and you entered them into service the same year, you don't need to create a different row for each one. You can group them together in one row and just change the quantity to 6, provided that they have the same rough annual mileage and fuel consumption between those vehicles. So once you have those entered in, the only other thing to do is to do the same information for fleet expansion. So if you are expanding your service or changing your spare ratio in any way, and you know that you're going to be getting more vehicles in the future that expand your fleet size, you can enter that information in here. It's the same information as above. It's just a way of visually separating that so you know what's currently in operations versus what might be in operations in the future. With this information completed, the last table that's in the fleet input tab is scrolling over to the right here, the ZEB purchase percentage table. So what this is going to do is going to help provide insight into what your procurement strategy is for zero emission buses in the future. So maybe your agency's decided to procure all battery electric buses, or maybe it's all hydrogen, or maybe it's a mix of both. Maybe your agency's established a specific year by which they're going to procure those different vehicle types. All that information is really critical to understanding what the emissions and costs are going to be moving forward. So it's important that you enter this information based on what those goals and objectives are. For this example, you can see that this agency is not procuring any zero emission vehicles for the first 6 years, and then after 2030, they're doing half battery electric and half fuel cell electric vehicles. So you can see that moving forward. And so these percentages will be applied to any of the purchases that will be for replacing vehicles moving forward. So that's the ZEV purchase percentage table, and that's the last table that you'll need to enter for the fleet inputs tab. Now moving over to the infrastructure input tab. So there are several variables on here for infrastructure that you have the opportunity to adjust as well. All cells in here do have default values, but they should be adjusted as needed. There's nothing inherently true about any of these values necessarily. We've done our best to provide estimates based on our experience for what typically agencies like to pursue in terms of charger to dispenser ratio and things like that. But you should definitely tailor this as much as possible to quotes that you've received or your experience or expertise when it comes to your transition. So the first one up here is just general information. That includes the inflation rate, which impacts how much the base cost for those vehicles in the year 2024 will be inflated for future years up to 2040. That can be adjusted as needed. We have it at 3%. You can make it more or less depending on what you are projecting. The second one is existing conditions, and this is for maintenance bays and existing electrical power. Maintenance bays, renovations to those and maintenance to those is impacted particularly for hydrogen vehicles. So the number of vehicle maintenance bays that you have for CNG or non-CNG may be impacted in this section. The existing electrical power in kilowatts, again, we have in here 2,000 kilowatts. You should go ahead and update that based on what your facility capacity is. You can usually find this on a utility bill or by consulting other folks within the agency. But that really provides a baseline for if you're using battery electric buses, how much additional power infrastructure needs to be installed to accommodate those new vehicles. There are a couple other sections of this for if you're using fuel cell vehicles and if you're using battery electric vehicles. So for fuel cell, you can do the delivery type here. Different costs are associated with different fuel types, delivery schemes. And then for the amount of hydrogen that you're using per day, that can also be depicted here and then changed accordingly. For battery electric buses, the infrastructure assumptions that we're mostly looking at here are the number of on-route chargers, dispensers per charger, buses per charger, and then how much power that each charger is conveying. And you can change this accordingly. You can change it for both cutaways and for buses in case those ratios are different. You can also make these non-integer values in case it's not exactly a 2-to-1 ratio. You can use decimals in here and adjust those accordingly. And then lastly, on the infrastructure input tab is the cost section. So the charger cost and installation costs and all that is based on our experience and what we've typically seen. But if you're receiving a quote or an estimate that's different from these, you can go ahead and update this to reflect exactly the amount that you're seeing. The last thing I'll take note of is the planning project costs. So a lot of times when you're doing a transition, there are additional ancillary costs that might not be reflected in this model. Maybe there's an additional planning effort that has to take place or an additional maintenance project to get your facility ready that isn't quite incorporated into this model. So this is a good kind of catch-all cell that you can use to kind of add value if there are additional costs that are not incurred based on some of the operating characteristics that we've discussed here. So just something to keep in mind. Now on the moves output tool, again, this is the one that is optional. You can insert information in here that helps tailor the emission analysis to your agency more specifically. So what MOVES is, again, is an emission simulator provided by the EPA. It lets you estimate specific emissions like CO2, NOx, PM10, PM2.5, and SO2 based on your fleet. Now, existing data in this tab can just be replaced if you do execute a moves run for your specific fleet. You can do that by following the emissions tool user guide, which outlines that process, and that's on the DRPT website as well. Otherwise, what the emissions data will use is what's in here right now, and this is the existing fleet characteristics for typical transit vehicles in Virginia, incorporating that weather and those characteristics by these different fuel types. So you can either do a new moves run and copy and paste over the same data in this exact format here, or you can use this. Either way, it's going to apply what's in this table and multiply it by the mileage that you've calculated by entering into your fleet input tab previously to produce your overall emissions. So that is it in terms of inputs. You have your two required input tabs in blue. You have the moves output tab here. And then moving forward, we're going to take a closer look at some of the outputs here in green. So starting with the fleet composition outputs tab, we have both a table and a graph that's going to show your annual fleet composition. Again, this is broken down by fuel type. So we have, for any given year, you can see the type of vehicles that are in your fleet. So for example, given the fleet input data that we've provided up until 2034, operating mostly legacy fuel in this scenario, and then we start to transition to battery electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles in this scheme. Below this graphic on the same tab, you have your annual bus purchases. And again, this is by vehicle type, so you can just see which year specifically you're going to be purchasing the quantity of vehicles by that fuel type. And again, this is really helpful for just visualizing what the approach that you've outlined is going to look like in practice. So that's the first output tab. Moving over to the emissions output tab, what we have are different tables that outline overall what the emissions reductions are over time, and then by specific pollutant type as well. So we have that in table form, and then if you just scroll to the right here, we have that in graphic form as well. These line graphs show, the first one shows the percent change in emissions for all pollutant types over time. And then these other ones towards the bottom as you scroll down show by each individual pollutant what the volume change is for that pollutant. So for CO2 in tons, for NOx in kilograms, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, on the total cost output tab, this is also calculated directly. You don't need to change anything like this on this tab. We do have fuel cost per mile and maintenance cost per mile that, again, we've calculated based on energy projections and our research on fuel costs and then maintenance costs. So these are fairly accurate, but if these change over time, or if you're seeing something in your operations that is different from what these numbers are reflecting, you can go ahead and update these costs per mile, and that will impact your overall total cost as well. But the real takeaways on this tab are, again, the graphs at the bottom here. What you have in this first one is transition costs by year. So for each of the categories that we've broken these costs down into, infrastructure, legacy fuel fleet, fuel, maintenance, and ZEB fleet, we have what the costs are by each year. And then to the right, we have by each of those categories what the total costs are for those categories across the entire transition. So by 2040, how much are you paying in each of these categories overall? And so you can see what that looks like, again, broken down by those same 5 categories. So those are the main takeaways from the Outputs tab. Again, in summary, the fleet tool allows you to just estimate your costs and emissions for your entire fleet transition. And if you have additional questions about how to use the tool, I hope you can reference this video or the instructions tab at the beginning of the tool, or the user guide for the fleet tool that is linked on the DRPT website. along with the fleet transition template and other helpful resources. So thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed this video.